Hi everyone, Dave Baggett here again with another episode of Phish Friday, and as always I'm joined by our fearless Phish fighter, Bakar Alibay, who is our analyst who finds all these cool fish, and today's going to be a lot of fun because we're going to look at the sneaky ways that attackers can hide text in emails from the end users, hidden text as we call it, and then how those techniques confuse the secure email gateways. So let's dive right in. Show the slides here. So I thought we'd start out today with an example of the kind of hidden text, just to sort of frame what we're talking about here. And we see this sort of thing all the time. Bakar, I would say this looks pretty legit. It looks like it's an Office 365 voicemail. And
Yes.
We talk a lot at Inky about, well, how does the human recipient figure out who the mail appears to be from? You know, if you think about this from a human cognition standpoint, obviously the human must be looking at things in the mail like text and colors and layout features to figure out that it looks like it's Microsoft and it's a brand they know. You know, so for example, they might look at that text in the upper left corner and see that looks like a Microsoft logo. You might see that phrase Microsoft account. And that's what tells the human, hey, this looks like it's from Microsoft. And obviously the attackers are using this human ability to recognize brands to fool people into thinking the mail really is from a brand that they trust when it's in fact from the attacker. So, and I would say, you know, again, this looks pretty good. I know you've got a few things you found that were a little bit suspicious looking with this if you look closely, right?
Right. If you look at the IP address, it's too long. It has one too many dots. And in the country, United States, is actually misspelled. There's no D in United.
So now this could be a mistake, right? Or they could have intentionally misspelled United States. And we'll talk a little bit about why they might have done that. But what's really kind of fun about this example is it looks, again, pretty normal. But what we did was we took the HTML content of the mail and we modified it simply to make the text that the attacker hid in the mail visible to us here. We basically made it show up as green, and here's what you get. So you can see there's actually a ton of hidden text here. So almost every other letter has this gibberish text, this green text in there that's breaking up all the words. So this is an example of zero font, right? And we're going to talk about specifically how that works, but this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. So the attackers have crafted this email cleverly so that it looks like it's from a brand that their target victim knows and trusts, but they've modified the HTML to put stuff in there that while it's not visible to the end user at all, I mean, we've made it visible here by modifying the HTML, but the way it arrived, it looked like the previous slide, where it looks completely normal to the end user. And we'll talk about, they do this because they want to confuse the secure email gateway or other mail protection system. So I thought maybe we'd dive right into a few examples. Tell us about this one. Now, I know this one uses what you call the CSS display none technique, but can you talk about the highlights of this one and what it's doing here?
Right. So this is a voicemail phish, and there's been so many variants, and phishers like to use different words for voicemail, like voice note or voice message. So if you look in the subject, they're using a funny looking V, and that's not an English word. So you can't really match on V call. And then in the next block, they misspelled length. So if you're looking for the string length, you're not going to get a match. And finally, it says play audio, but that's actually not an I, it's an L.
So now this isn't even hidden text. This is just really what we would call confusables. And I think we've talked about that in another Phish Friday, but let's just talk a little bit about why the attackers want to do this. So, you know, obviously Inky's using all kinds of fancy computer vision stuff. We render the mail, you know, we run every image and text and bit of colors and everything through classifiers. But I think virtually every mail protection system, even though they don't do that stuff, they have some kind of pattern matching, right? So they're looking at scam indicative patterns in the mails from phishing or spam they've seen before. So maybe this V call or voicemail or this pattern where it says caller ID and length, that might match a pattern that they've stored in their rule database that tells them, hey, this looks either fishy or spammy, right?
Yep.
And so I guess, it's worth mentioning they're putting these funny characters in because when they put the weird V that's not a V, well, now since it's not a V, if the seg has a pattern looking for V call, it won't match because that's not a V. And likewise, like you said, if they're looking for length, that's not going to match here either because it doesn't say length, it's misspelled. And why did they use I guess they used that funny V character because they still want it to kind of look like a V to the end user. So again, they're trying to confuse the end user into seeing nothing unusual and confuse the seg so the seg's pattern matching doesn't work. So this is the raw HTML and it just looks like a giant block of text. But if you formatted this, using an editor, you can see that it was HTML. But so talk about how this is working and what's going on with the hidden text in this email. Because if you look back here, it doesn't look like there's anything hidden, right? It looks like they have some funny misspellings, but there's nothing obviously hidden.
Yeah.
So obviously we're including this because there is stuff hidden. So talk about what they're doing here.
So they're using CSS display property to hide elements within the text. And if you set the property to none, it basically just does not display any of the elements after display none.
Right. So I guess people need to understand what CSS is. So you've got HTML, which is tags, and they have things like P for paragraph or bold or something. And that was the way you used to style things in the 90s with HTML. You'd put a bold tag in or italic. And then I guess somewhere in the 2000s, around then, the web migrated to something called CSS, cascading style sheets, where they separated out all that stylistic stuff. So you wouldn't have a bold tag anymore in the HTML. You'd have a P tag for paragraph or a div tag or a span tag. And then you'd have properties on those elements that were CSS properties, right? So and the properties would let you say how you wanted it to look. So you could say, I guess, something about the font as one of those properties, since you could say, font type or something. So this display none, that's a CSS property. What is that doing again? Why would you use display none?
To hide things.
So maybe you're a legitimate HTML designer and you just want something to not show up as there. You could label it as display none and then it says, hey, just don't even render this at all, I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Interesting. So what they've done is, I guess here, they've taken text in the mail that appears in the HTML. So the seg's going to read it if they parse the HTML, but they've made it not render by setting it to display none.
Yep, and that's actually what it looks like when a seg reads it.
So the raw text of this thing actually has, let's go back and look at the way it looks to the recipient. So they've got example.com, obviously we redacted that, but attention, name. But then if we look at what the text looks like for real, you've got example.com, all this stuff. So this is a span where they set it to font size, or they set it to display none, I guess is what you're saying. This is visible. This stuff's invisible. And then you've got ID here, but actually look at that. They even have before this D, invisible gibberish. So basically they're setting display none on certain spans so the user doesn't see them at all. But the seg, when the seg's trying to pattern match this thing, this is the text they're looking at. That's what you're saying.
And it's impossible to match for those strings you're looking out for.
Right, like maybe voicemail or something, or anything else that might be indicative of this particular voicemail scam. So it's a way of cloaking the attacker's use of some existing template so that even if the seg has seen that template before, they won't match it against this because they've got to somehow match all this extra gibberish in here. So here's a white on white example. What does that mean, white on white?
So when we say white on white, we mean a white background and white font. so it looks invisible to the end user.
Right. So there, I guess it takes up space, but you don't see it as a user because the characters are, like you said, exactly the same color as the background, white. So it appears blank, even though the characters actually are there. They are rendered, unlike the previous one where they weren't rendered at all. Here they're rendered. They're just rendered in the same color as the background, so they're you can't see them. But I guess you actually can see them. Talk about what you did here.
So what I did was I just highlighted it, or you can also do a Control A, Command A to select all. So now you can see the hidden text. Although it's not really hidden, it's just white font with a white background.
Right. So you're basically by doing that Control A and selecting the whole message, you're basically temporarily changing the background color to blue there. So now the white,
Yeah,
because it's white on blue instead of white on white. And look, they even have a D between almost and full, because you got to imagine every SAG has some scanner for your mailbox is almost full, right? Because we see
right.
these fake overquota things constantly. Very sneaky. And so here, explain what this is. Again, a wall of text here, but try to explain what this is, what's going on in the HTML here. That FFF.
So those white colors that we previously saw, they have a color of FFF, 6 Fs, and that's the RGB color of white.
Oh, I see. Right, because in computers, a lot of times they will, instead of having a color and just naming it, they'll actually specify a mix of red and green and blue. I guess FF is the highest value you can have at a byte in hexadecimal. So it means 255. So that means maximum red, maximum green, maximum blue, which if you think about it, I guess translates to white. So they're basically just setting the color of the text to white. And I guess they're assuming the background of the mail client, the background's going to be white too. Is that a function of the HTML of the mail, or is it a function of whether your mail client's in dark mode? Or maybe either?
It's a function of the mail client, because I've been working with other people and they can see it immediately, and that's because they're in dark mode. So this trick does fail if you have dark mail enabled on your mail application.
Yeah, so maybe we should all turn on dark mode, because the attackers assume everything, our backgrounds are all white. Interesting. And now this is a zero font example, and that first one that we showed, that Office 365 example, that was also a zero font. Well, let's go into a little more detail about how this is working. So again, this looks a little bit shady, maybe, but if you're in a hurry, you might believe this is real. And here again, you see they're trying to kind of look like a logo up here, but this is just text, right?
Right.
So we see that a lot. We call this a logo type, when the attacker's using text but making it big and maybe putting it on a color background. I remember we saw an example a few years ago that was really hilarious, where it was a fake Target mail. It was just big white text saying Target on a red background. But it kind of looks like Target branding, even though it's just text. So here they're doing the Office 365 SharePoint thing. So talk a little bit about this one, if you could.
Yeah, there's actually a lot going on, because we redacted the email because it's a real email sent to one of our customers. We replaced their domain name with example.com. So this email is pretending to be from the user's company's HR department, and is saying you have a document about some new COVID-19 directives or rules.
So we've talked about these COVID-19 scams, and I know you've classified at least 50 of these different COVID-19 templates. And it's like Mad Libs, where they're just filling in victim's company name here, victim's boss's name here, maybe. It's like plug and play mail merge for evil purposes. And of course, we redacted it so it says example instead of the real company. And again, this sort of highlights something we've talked about a bit before, which is the attackers are just completely shameless, and they will exploit any opportunity. And right now with the pandemic, people are worried They're probably working from home, so they're probably not in the most comfortable environment. And they want to get information about their company's policy. So this is mimicking a mail from HR at the company saying, here's the COVID-19 information you need. So this is particularly evil. And even beyond that, I suppose it's using zero font too, as we're going to learn. So set the font size. So talk about this again, giant wall of HTML, but what's worth looking at here? I see you've highlighted in white a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, so they set the font size to 0 for those gibberish characters that they want to include in the raw email that a SEG will scan. But to the end user wouldn't see it because it's zero font. I mean, it's just not there.
And indeed, you don't see any text except for what looks pretty normal. But here's the text. So there we go again, right? They set the font size to 0 here, 0 here, but then this is the text they can read. So this must be set to non-zero. And again, I guess we haven't really talked about regular expressions on a Phish Friday before, but almost every SEG uses some kind of regular expression-based pattern matching engine where they'll say, if you see the following sequence of characters, and the regular expression lets them essentially put some variants in there. So they could say, anytime I see the word example, maybe they could replace the A with a question mark character, meaning any character can appear there. So there's this variability that the SEGs can build into the regular expressions, but it's hard to imagine them contemplating this as something they're going to pattern match, because it really is probably just randomly generated, right?
Yeah.
In this case here, that's the word official, but they've put their zero font stuff in the middle of the word. And here again, you could imagine the SEG might have a pattern, a regex, that says, if I see official COVID-19 directives, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad mail, but it might, in concert with other aspects of the mail, indicate that it's fraudulent. But so now their regex isn't going to match this because there's this extra stuff in there. And if we go back, you can see where it says official COVID-19 directives. That's how it looks to the end user. So basically what they're doing, I guess, is, to your point, those characters really are in the HTML. There are text nodes in the HTML for those characters. It's just they've, again, used CSS to set the font size to 0, and the browser or the email client will just happily follow the instruction and say, okay, I'm going to render these characters as 0 pixels high and 0 pixels wide, so they're invisible. Now, I know we've also seen some variability in mail clients rendering these 0 font things, right?
Right.
So I think Outlook Desktop will actually render this a little differently. You'll actually see little underscore characters or something, if I recall correctly. So in some clients, it actually would be visible to the end user, but I think most, Outlook on the web, Apple Mail, desktop and mobile, those are Gmail, it's going to look like this, and they're not going to see those characters there. So what happens when the unsuspecting victim clicks through to get their COVID-19 precautions?
So this is actually an image, but on the right, there is a credential harvesting form. And if you notice the domain name, it's very confusable. The domain is msoffice-mailbox.top. So it looks like it looks like a SharePoint directory, but it's actually just an image. So you have to sign in to get your COVID-19 precautions. And on the right, I just used test@test.com and some gibberish password that I always enter to test phishing sites.
So don't try this at home, but you actually go and investigate what happens when you interact with these sites.
Right.
I noticed a couple things. I mean, one, I noticed that this shared drive msoffice-mailbox.top, now I think security practitioners would think .top is a big red flag, because we know that people go on Namecheap and they can buy .top domains for $1 or something. But the average person's not going to know that. So this does highlight something that we see all the time, where the attackers are smart enough to register new domains that will look plausible to the end user. So if you're a regular user, you're not a security professional, you see this mailbox, Microsoft mailbox, MS Office mailbox dot top, and you're like, well, I guess that could be Microsoft. It looks plausible. So this is another interesting example of how part of the weakness in the system is that anybody can register absolutely any domain they want and call it whatever they want, right? And it's impossible, I suppose, for the registrars to catch all this, because there are just infinitely many ways that the attacker can create something that seems plausible, right?
Yeah, and it's an automated process on the registrar's end when they register a new domain. So no one really reviews all the hundreds of new domains that get registered in a day.
So they'd have to deploy some kind of sophisticated AI, almost akin to what we do, looking at the HTML, the mail, to look at the domain name and see, was that something a person would think was an impersonation of a brand? That does sound hard. I notice also it says dangerous. So we see this where eventually all these Phish that we catch, if they have URLs in the body, they'll get reported to the threat list, right? So this probably got reported somehow into Google Safe Browsing, and that's why you're seeing that warning.
It did, yes.
And I guess, we've talked a lot about Phish that have URLs. If you look, obviously we do this too, the SEGs will look up all the URLs that appear in the mail and see if they're on any of these threat lists. But of course, that doesn't really work if you're the first person to receive that mail with that URL. And I guess it also doesn't work if there's no URL in the mail. Like we see all kinds of mails that pretend to be someone's marketing manager asking him to buy gift cards. No URL in there. So
right.
the whole threat feed way of blocking phishing sort of breaks down 0 day and when there aren't URLs in there. But it's interesting that eventually you can see by the time you looked at this and took the screenshot, the world had caught up and they had identified this as a phishing site, looks like. So you bravely entered your credentials here. What happened?
So it redirected me to a real WHO resource.
Oh, so I guess they captured your credentials, which fortunately in this case were fake, squirreled them away somewhere, and then to make you, the victim, think this is all real, they sent you to the real WHO page. So actually, I mean, this does sort of, it brings up another aspect of social engineering here, which is if the phisher wants to be most effective, they don't just want to phish you, they also don't want to get caught. So they want to make the victim think that nothing happened bad. And this is a textbook example of that, right? They're basically putting up something that looks like a real Microsoft page, which they've carefully cloned through an image in this case. I guess we've seen other cases where they cloned entire websites, right?
Yep.
We talked about, I guess you found one that was pretended to be banks for COVID stimulus payments, and there was a whole website, right? So here they've just taken the easy way out and they just redirect you to who.int. So probably if you're the employer, you're like, really? They made me go through all that trouble just to go to the who's page anybody can get to? That's a little weird.
Yeah, so that does bring up a precaution to be suspicious is why did the email have you log in, go on a different site just to view this information when they could have just put it in the email to begin with?
Right, so be wary as a user if you seem to be jumping through a lot of hoops to get to something you could have gotten otherwise. And also be wary of links to anything in mails. We often tell people that even if you're running Inky and Inky's going to catch most of this stuff, you're probably better off, if you think you got a mail from your bank with a link in it, you're probably better off just typing the name of your bank into web search and going there that way. Then you know you're talking to the bank and not somebody else who fooled you in the mail. And this thing here, so I guess the other thing that's worth mentioning is, at least with Inky, and I don't know if the SEGs do this, we rewrite the URLs in the bodies of the mail. And I know when they click through to this site, we would run that same brand forgery computer vision analysis on this page, in other words, the website page. And that might have allowed us, even if we missed the initial mail and didn't think it was suspicious, to catch them before we let them actually get harvested here, right?
Yeah, because they are using real Microsoft logos.
Yeah, and it does point out too, one of the things that we mention a lot when we talk about the image recognition part of computer vision that we do to detect, essentially to determine the apparent brand. It's not just a matter of matching the Windows logo or the Microsoft logo. This is a well-known logo to everyone because it's indicative of Office. So there's all kinds of brand imagery that might indicate to a human recipient or a human website visitor in this case that it's a brand they know, not just a single logo. It might be a whole range of them. Really interesting stuff. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We've got more of this to come in a future Phish Friday. We'll talk a bit more about some even more clever ways that people can hide stuff in mails. But hopefully this gave you a window into what the attackers are doing to sneak text into the mail that fools the mail protection system, but is completely invisible to the end user. So that's our time for today. Everyone have a great weekend and stay safe. Bye-bye.